Santana. My maiden name is Nardi. I was born in Sault Ste. Marie at not 632, but the house next door, which belonged to the Tucci family. And they had a little house behind their house, and I was born in that house. Dr. LaHaye delivered me. I was the second girl born in that family to my mother and dad. My mother was Adelina Suriano Nardi. My father was Gabriel Nardi. My mother was born in Sault Ste. Marie. My father was born in Italy, in Calabria, in a little town called Di Pignano. I lived there until I was 2.5 years old, and then we moved to New York City. And my date of birth is June 25th, 1932.
Dominic Santana, born at 678 Queen Street West, not too far from where Mary was born. And I'll show you how these things all tie in eventually. My mom and dad, Frank Santana, born in Canada, son of Dominic and Rosina Santana, who had immigrated from Italy in the turn of the century. Now what?
Where were you born?
Yeah.
The date?
So I was born February the 5th, 1932, at home at the address at 678 Queen West, and had a midwife as an attendant to Dr. LaHaye delivering us. We were all born at home except one of my brothers, the last one. That's pretty well.
How did they come to live in the Sault, your parents?
My grandfather immigrated from Italy, and why he chose Sault Ste. Marie, I really don't know, because he had a sister that immigrated, that came to Sault Ste. Marie and moved on into California. And I often said to my mother, why didn't Grandpa, follow his sister, and we would have been all born in California, where the weather's a lot better than in Sault Ste. Marie, not knowing what's happening in California with the faults that they have and the earthquakes, etc. But he came over to Canada in 1901, and he was only a 21-year-old boy at the time. And 4 years later, his father came from Italy. His name was Santo Santana, and he brought my uncle, who was my grandfather's first son, and his name was the same as my great-grandfather, Santo Santana, and they came here at the turn of the century. Then later on, my grandfather called for my grandmother, and a lot had happened in the meantime, which I think I'll mention to you a little bit later on about his history. But he had 3 more children here in Canada. He had my father and my 2 aunts, and they lived in the west end of the city. And I grew up in the same house. When he first came to here, he lived on West Street, and I believe that the house that he lived in, eventually my Aunt Virgie Bruciani lived in that house, and they all lived in the West End. Even my other aunt, after she got married, she married my Aunt Assunta Santana, married an uncle of Mary's, and they lived just around the corner on Albert Street. So people, came to the Sault from Italy. That was a comfortable zone for them, because they had other people that they knew there. They spoke the language, although they all spoke English other than the grandparents. But my father and my aunts, they all spoke English, and their children were taught English. They never even taught them the Italian language. I speak it because, being firstborn, I had the influence of my grandparents to speak a few words and understand and get the tongue familiar to my ear. And then when I was a 10-year-old, 11-year-old boy, I worked at a butcher shop on Albert Street that was purely Italian, at Bertolo and Son. and I became a clerk in the store, and I eventually started cutting meat. In fact, some of my patients say I was still a butcher after I was practicing dentistry. But yeah, it was a close-knit community, and people felt comfortable being together there. With the neighbors, you know, they all spoke the Italian, because we had a mix in the West End of mainly Italian immigrants and their offspring, and we had a few from Croatian, Yugoslav, and some Polish, and we were all considered the same type of people. We had the same backgrounds. We loved the same type of foods, even though we had different foods. But we ate each other's foods, and really got along really well. And you know, no discrimination going on amongst those people at that time. Although there was a lot of discrimination in Sault Ste. Marie at that time, though. But you know, that gives us a bit of a history on how they got here.
Now, my father's history is a little bit different. He arrived, his brother was living here, and he arrived here when he was 17, and he decided it was just too cold. So he somehow just went to the United States and lived for 7 years in Melrose Park, Illinois, Chicago area, and decided then to come visit his brother, at which time he met my mother, who was 15 years old, going on 16, and he eventually married her and stayed here. And after 2.5 years, at that time it was the height of depression, and unable to get work, and I remember him telling me that in 16 months he had one shift of working, and that was shoveling snow from the tracks. And he went home and said, I will die if I stay in this country. So he went on to live in New York, and we followed him 2 years later, and I lived in New York, Brooklyn, New York for 24 years, and then married and came back. Meanwhile, my ties to Sault Ste. Marie were very strong because I had my grandparents and a lot of relatives. Came back when I was 5 for the summer, came back when I was 11, and my memories of that 11th year are everlasting in my brain because of the people I met that I'm still friends with today, and their children that we're still friends with. And it was a pleasure to be here at that time. And then eventually lived in New York City until I married, met my husband, and returned back to the Sault Ste. Marie area. My mother came back, my sisters came back, and that's it. And we're still here, had 5 children, and they're all here except for one daughter who lives in Toronto. That's
what
it.
were your earliest memories when you grew up in the West End? What always kind of springs to mind when you look back on those very early years in your life?
When I was growing up at 678 Queen Street West, we had a laneway there, and halfway up the laneway brought you from Queen Street to Albert Street. Halfway up the lane, my father's property had a barn on it, and the barn became a garage for his vehicles later on. But he had a barn, and he also had a chicken coop that was beside it, and he had a large garden between the house and these 2 other buildings. And that backyard was a whole community for me, because I was able to go into the garden, or I was able to go to the chicken coop and get eggs for my parents if I had to go and check the chickens and see if they had any eggs. The hens had been laying, or else I would go to the barn. And I don't recall too many animals in the barn, because my grandfather did have a team of Belgian horses that were really a beautiful set of horses. Now the Belgians are, I think, a cousin to the Clydesdales, and the Scarfone people in Sault Ste. Marie. The old man had also a set of horses, so there was a competition sort of going on between the Scarfones and the Santanas with these horses, and of course my grandfather's horses always outshone the Scarfones. But I remember those days, and then eventually, when my grandparents had passed on, my father was ruling the home. He had a cow a couple of times, because of the milk for the family. He had, 5 children. He also had a brother living with us, and he had a house full of people. And he had the chickens that helped along with the eggs and stuff. But I remember going up and down that lane, you know, and my mother would say, "Now go and get some bread." Well, I had a choice to go to 2 bakeries within walking distance. One was Rossi at the end of the lane, and if I wanted to take a right-hand turn behind the barn and go onto Rome Street, there was Verdecchia Bakery. So I could go and get bread at 2 different places and pay 10 or 11 cents a loaf of bread and bring it home. I remember Ross used to have these beautiful cakes that were like 25 cents a square. They were about 8 inches by 3 inches by about 4 inches thick, you know, and that'll be picked up by the answer machine. But
Can we stop it?
Oh, that's Michael. Okay.
Michael.
The laneway was a very important, as a kid growing up, the laneway was a very important area around the West End because, you know, traffic never went through the laneway because at the far end, Ribellatos had a home there, and you just didn't drive straight through the lane because the lane was a public place, but the people that lived beside the lane figured it was there, so they would park a vehicle there and you couldn't get through. Can you turn this off for a minute? You can turn that off over there, the answer machine over there, Kath. Yeah, just turn it to off. Should have did that before. That laneway, we were able to play ball in that lane, even though I'll bet you it wasn't any more than 15 feet wide. My father would take a vehicle, park it in there, and he and Vic Torelli would listen to the engine and check the timing on the car.
Just pull it out of the wall, Cathy.
There you go.
Shoot.
But
Good.
I remember a neighbor up the street, Olivio Corvetti. He used to be able to pitch softball underhand, and he had a wicked pitch, you know. And he and I would play in the lane, and I would catch for him. And many times he'd, you know, my thumb would get in the way and be snapped back, or I'd get the ball coming off of my glove and hitting me in the nose and give me a bleeding nose. But I remember playing in that lane, or at nighttime, you know, we would with the other. I'm talking when I was like under 10 years of age, maybe 11 or 12 at the most. And you would play at night. We'd play hide and seek, and it was like its own little community, that back lane area. And people that next door neighbors, the Celestinos, were there. They had boys and girls. And just across the way from them were the Lucianis and the Gervasis. We all were growing up in that neck of the woods, and we all used this area. It was like a little community of our own. And these people all are still alive, most of them, and they live some at Churchill Boulevard, and some live down on Bruce Street area, or it doesn't matter where, but that's where they grew up. Yeah, it was really interesting.
Mary, what do you remember about that 11th year when we went back to?
It's like it happened yesterday. It's so vivid in my memory. There again, it was the lane between my grandmother's house and the Tucci house. And we sat there every night. And Mary Kuchar, who lived in the little house that I was born in at the time, would bake a cake and bring it outside, and we'd bring coffee. And her sister, Emma, who is the mother of Connie Moore, would come over. Now, these are first cousins to my mother and to my grandfathers, my mother and father. And we would sit there and chat all night long, and I would babysit their children, which would be Connie and her sister Diane, or the Kuchar children, Mero and Pachalko. And my memories across the street, the Bellini family, that is Mark Bellini, his grandmother baptized me. It was the Spinas across the street. It was like Louis Bambaco's family, which are Angelo Bambaco. We put on a wonderful play, my sister and I, and the kids, and I sang Chattanooga Choo Choo, and my sister sang I Get the Neck of the Chicken. And community night that year, it was in the middle of the war, and the boys made a coffin, and they stuffed a suit, and my sister, who was very artistic, drew a picture of Hitler on this coffin, and Angelo and his brothers carried it in the parade, and they won first prize. And that was like a memory that was like, even nothing in New York could touch that. It was like so special. And every part of it, and these people are still in my memory. Mary Kuchar, Emma Tatasciore, the Marinellis down the street, Jimmy Marinelli. They were all friends of ours and friends of the family. And somehow or another, we all became... My grandmother baptized some of the Provenzano boys. I showed a picture of a water pitcher that my grandmother had bought when Mr. Mantello opened his jewelry store. This would be Frank Mantello's father. And for the respect of the fact that she had baptized some of his 10 children, she went and bought this pitcher for $4, and she had it in the top of her shelf, and which I now have. And it was just everything was a memory that I brought home with me to New York City and repeated and probably built it up in my mind to fantastic. It's enough of for a movie, the way I tell it. But it's something that I always keep in my heart and in my mind because it was such a special, special place.
Cathy, growing up in the West End, you knew everybody. I knew all the neighbors along Queen Street from west to James, actually to the tracks. I could name almost every family without having leaving anybody out. That's along Queen Street. Along James Street, the same way from Cathcart all the way to Portage Street, and all the way up Albert Street, Cathcart Street. Knew them all, right up to the tracks. And why did you remember all these things? I don't know. Maybe our memories were better in those days, but it seemed like people were stabilized. Everybody lived there. And when I moved away, nobody had been moved away. I went away to the university. I came back. They were still all living there, or the families were still living in there. It wasn't until after, I'm going to say in the 60s, that they started to leave the West End and start moving eastward because of the second generation of people. But, you got to know everybody that lived along the street. And it was nothing to go up the street and walk into somebody's houses. Is Tony home? And you walked into the house, or you went around the corner, you asked for Joey or whoever you were asking for. It didn't hesitate to walk into a person's house in those days. Nothing was locked. We never locked our house. And it was a very, very friendly community. And then, as you get older, things happen in the West End. Incidences go on, and you hear it from your parents in one thing or another. But it was a very unique place to be growing up from. And then from there, we could go over the High Line, which was off of Cathcart Street, and go into the Buckley area and in the Bayview area. And we knew a lot of people there because of the proximity. And in those days, you drove with a car. If you had a bicycle and you got there, you were lucky. But everything was by foot. You walked. Then we also had streetcars at the time, but we never took streetcars, or buses weren't around yet. But people at that time seemed very, very friendly, no matter what area of the West End you went into. And you could go to Steelton, Buckley, Bayview, and James Street area, and find that everybody, would know whoever you were asking about, and they were all friendly. They didn't hesitate to talk and give you directions or help you out with anything. And that's a long recollection that I have of my childhood in the West End.
Talking about going into that area, I could remember my mother saying they would take the High Line to go to Cumbar Manzo. That's Frank Manzo's father's farm, because they would plant their winter vegetables there, their potatoes and cabbage and stuff like that. On his farm, he would either allow them or rent it. And she said we would go to Cumbar. So obviously they baptized some of those children. And Cumbar Manzo and then come home with the vegetables in a cart or some kind. But I think you should tell the story of your grandfather and his arms.
Yeah, I'll get to that. But the High Line was an extension of when you came around James Street and then you start heading west. You could stay to your right and go up this hill, or else stay on the left and continue down to Cathcart Street towards West Street, and you're staying on the streets. But if you went on this right avenue that went straight up, it was sort of an incline, and it was called the High Line. And what it did, it was over the tracks of Algoma Steel, of the CPR, ACR lines, and then it came down on the other side. And you know, I'm trying to think of how that thing was constructed underneath with the beam, and I can't recall. I think God held it up, but in any case, it was there, and they tore it down later on after the war. But that brought you down to number 1 gate at Algoma Steel, and then in that area there was another area called Tacoma. Tagoda. What would it have been? Tagoda or Tacoma, where the houses were, where the Algoma Steel executives lived. They lived in
there was a little bit of a residential for the wheels from Algoma Steel.
Yeah, the Algoma. Yeah, so you know, you could get down to there, and it also would take you, if you at the bottom of this highland on the other side, if you made a hard, sharp turn around the at the bottom of the road, it would take you on an old tote road through the bush and take you to Buckley. And eventually the road did open up on the west end side of the Highland and brought you towards Bayview, and it became the base line and so on. But I mean, those were exciting days to travel those areas. And you know, like I said, you know, you want to go and see Teddy DeLuca, who lived in Buckley. You walked over the Highland, underneath the Highland. Very seldom underneath because it was kind of dangerous. But you would get onto Buckley Bush Road and travel to Wallace Terrace, and you had a bunch of friends that lived there. And I remember there was a creek. I think I found out the name as I got older. It was called, I think, the West Davion Creek. We used to swim in that creek. You know, that's a long, long time ago.
As you got older, what did you do for your entertainment? What was it like growing up as a teenager in the West End?
In the West End, well, I remember my first dances were at the Marconi Hall or at the G. Verde Hall. They had formed a club called the Chicks and Chucks, and we'd go to the hall on a Sunday night, and there'd be a dance going on there, and be all the jitterbugging going on at the time. That's where you learned. You know, you never went to the dance school to learn how to dance. You went and you had the gumption to go and ask a young lady to dance at that time, and if she knew how to dance, then she taught you. Otherwise, you both stumbled around until you got the right steps. But you know what? Guys coming out of the West End, we were one of the best jitterbuggers going. And I don't want to sell myself too short, but I think I was a pretty good dancer myself. Then later on we went downtown towards the east end of the city, across the street from Barsanti's restaurant was a hall called the Columbia Hall, but the Palm Gardens.
Palm Gardens.
Palm Gardens is the word
Gardens.
I'm thinking about. And on Friday nights we'd go there, and of course all the teenagers would be up there dancing away, and there'd be music, and it was just fantastic, you know. The odd time, and when you went to school after the collegiate would have a dance, but dancing was a very important part of our lives as we were growing up in our teen years, because we had no TV at the time. We didn't stay home and watch television. There was nothing to watch. We'd listen to the radio the odd time, but that was our form of entertainment. We couldn't go to the theater too much or to the shows because they were 12 cents or 15 cents at night, and we couldn't afford it at that time.
I think also the fact that there was no TV is the fact that all these memories remain in everyone's head. Because instead of turning the TV on at 9 o'clock, you got together with family and friends and had a coffee or whatever. The children got together, the parents got together. And not having any other entertainment, this was your entertainment. So our memories remain. We probably being the last generation that will have these memories of a non-TV society where it was strictly people and this was your entertainment. Whether you were gossiping about somebody or telling a story, this was our entertainment, and it was a loving entertainment. And I feel sorry for the kids today that don't have it. And hopefully sometime or another they do get together with their families and will remember these things that I have tried very strongly to instill in the minds of my children, is how important and how wonderful those days were before computers and before TVs.
We did a lot of visiting in those days, you know, as children with their parents. The parents went out to visit an uncle or an aunt. They brought the children with them. And the children were there, and they played with their cousins. So that brought up a real closeness with the families. I have to tell you about my grandfather. Would you like to hear a story about my grandfather, Dominic, came to this country when he was 21 years of age. And he was married, and he had a wife and son in Italy. And his father was in Italy. His father's name was Santo. And the early years that he got over here, and I don't know all the answers to his demise, but I'm going to tell you what happened, that he was in his early 20s, and I guess at that time there they used to go fishing, and to bring home a lot of fish with a net, they used to bring dynamite with them, and they would throw it in the water, and the explosion would mummify the fish and come to the surface, and he would scoop them up with this net. Unfortunately, my grandfather held on to that stick of dynamite too long and blew off both of his arms below the elbow. Now, I never asked these questions of my parents or even my grandfather, but I don't know how he survived that, because I'm thinking now of the bleeding, of the distance where he might have been at. The hospital at that time had just been formulated in the early 1900s. How did he survive all that? And yet this man raised the uncle that came over with his father in 2005. That's when his father came over and he brought his son. And he raised that son, plus his wife came over 2 years later, I think in 2007, and he had 3 more children. And raised this family with no arms, but I could recall that the stumps that he had below his elbows, no prosthesis in those days, but he used to be able to man a team of horses. He used to take work for the city by hauling coal and wood and whatever he could to support his family. Because those were the Depression days, you know, as well. And how he did it, I don't know. But he became a well-known individual in the West. Everybody knew Dominic Santana, the one that had no arms. And now there's another Dominic Santana in the city here that has an amputation, like his grandfather, only it's on my left leg. And I'm managing, but that's why I keep thinking about how the man survived, knowing what I went through with the modern technique of surgery and everything these days. It's just amazing how these people survived in those days, you know, the stamina. Yeah.
What was your first job growing up?
I think I mentioned before that at 11 years of age, I worked for Gino Bertolo in the grocery store. I worked there just as a young boy that actually took me in almost like a son, and I used to do some stocking of shelves and delivering some groceries and one thing. Because I was only 11 years of age. But eventually, I started behind the meat counter, and I was actually cutting some meat for them. And by the time I was 15, I was a full-fledged butcher, and I really knew how to cut up a side of beef. But that was my first job. And then right after that, I got a job with J.J. Fitzpatrick and Sons, who was a contractor in town. And at that time, I was making 75 cents an hour. And I worked during the summer months, because I was going to school at collegiate at the time. And we worked in homes. I recall there's a house on Wellington Street, right at the top end of Kohler Street. And if you'll ever look at that house, it's a cement block house. I think they painted like a dark gray now or something like that. But that was the last job I worked with them, because I was up in the attic putting insulation. Now, at that time, we just were bare from the waist up, and we put this fiberglass insulation in there. And I went home itchy with fiberglass all over my body, sweating up in the attic. I never forgot that day. And you know what? I said, I don't want to do this anymore. But that was one of the jobs. But right after that, I got into Algoma Steel when I became 16 years of age, and worked there weekends, worked there during the summer months until I went right through University. And that helped me along, But then I became a dentist, and the rest is history.
It was a very strange story because I was, at the time, engaged to be married. And I had been going with a fellow that was working with Walter Cronkite on CBS News. And it was a 3-year situation. But at that time, religion played a very big part in your life. And he was not Catholic, and I was. So there was a lot of strife. And came to the Sault to pick up my mother. My father had passed away. She'd come to spend the summer with her parents, and met him at Sunnyside Beach, where his family and my aunt and uncle had a cottage, or had property. And he said, I'm going to marry you. And I said, no, you're not. And 9 months later, we got married. June 14th, 1957. 1958. And went to Montreal because he was in his last year of university, of dental school. Came home, had a baby girl. 15 months later, had a baby boy. 20 months later, had another baby boy, and on and on. And we've done quite well, thank God to Don, who has worked very hard, and I have worked very hard, and had a beautiful cottage at Sunnyside, had one at Point-au-Par. We had 3 lovely homes in Florida. We had a beautiful house here, which we've sold, and this is our final resting place, we hope. And that's the end of the story. Our 4 children live in Sault Ste. Marie. We see them on a daily basis, thank God. And Lisa lives in Toronto, has her own business, very artistic, and visits us whenever she can, which is quite often. And that's it. Unfortunately, we both have been plagued with bad health in the end of our lives, but we're hanging in there. Me, a victim of hepatitis C 32 years ago. Apparently, I've made history. And we both survive and still manage to live a fairly good life. And our friends surround us, which is the most important thing that we could have. Yeah. Friends and family.
Yeah, we're fortunate to have
very
friends,
fortunate.
Great friends.
And that's really about it.
Does any one person or occasion stick with you about your whole past history in Sault Ste. Marie, Mary?
In Sault Ste. Marie? Not any one person. I think the love I had for my grandparents, especially my grandmother, who was, my grandfather died before her, and the closeness. I lived with my mother-in-law when we first got married, had my baby there, and daily visited my grandmother, and she was a sweet, sweet lady. And and I have 2 sisters, one that moved here, and another one that still lives in the New York area. And we just spent our first summer in 53 years. We've been married 53 years. And this was the first summer we spent it together every day. And we literally talked every single day about life in New York, life in Sault Ste. Marie, and reminiscing. And you can't ask for more than that. It was just wonderful. And Don's family has been very good and very kind to me, took me in as a member of the family. We lost one of his sisters this year, which was quite sad. And his mother and dad, who I adored. His father was so special to me. And I think those are the memories that I bring with me of the Sioux.
I think you have to remember your parents as important people in your lives. Unfortunately, Mary and I both lost our fathers when they were very young. My father-in-law was in the early 50s. My dad was 55. And it really, really was a blow to me growing up because he was such a great man, and I just got to know him. I was starting to become his friend, and we were to go out and drive around the city and just chat about everything. And he went up and died, and I really missed him an awful lot. That was a heartbreaking situation in my life. You know, you go through lives with these valleys and peaks, and certain things really stick out. That was one of the ones that hit me the hardest as I was growing up. I had my own family started then, and then later on in life, another situation happened to me in 2004, whereas my son and I were working at my cottage, and unfortunately had an accident where we were cutting a tree down, and a piece of the lumber or the block of wood off the tree hit him. Almost killed him that day, but because he was such a young boy and a strong boy, he survived. And to this day, he's got two beautiful children that come to see me here and call me Nanu, Nanu, and they come and give us a lot of joy. And Michael himself, who was left with a deformity of a brain injury, in the sense that his left side, he has a certain amount of sensitivity is gone on the left side. He's got motor function, but no sensory function. But God bless him. He's a strong boy. He's raising his two children with his wife. And these are the people that are close to you, you know. Mind you, I have 4 other children that are as dear to me. But, you know, when something happens to a child like that, it brings you so much closer to, you know. And my 5 children, we didn't mention this before, but I have my first child is a female, Denise, and she was a dental hygienist all of her life, and she's got a home of her own. Mark is married, and he has a child that's 18 years old, and he's playing junior hockey as we speak. John has 2 lovely little girls with his wife. John married a dentist as well. And then there was Lisa, who lives in Toronto, to a lovely young man, and they have no children. But and then there's Michael left in the Sault. So we have 5 children that bring us everyday joy, and each one is different than the other. You know, you can't say that they both are identical, because they're really not. And but my in-laws, my mother-in-law was a great woman, and she was if she had to tell you something, she just didn't hold back. She just came out and told you about it, no matter what it was. She had a lot of advice, and a lot of the advice came from her own senses, and a lot of it today still holds. You know, she often talked about eating out of aluminum pots when they used to cook. This was years ago. And today we find out that, you know, aluminum causes dementia and things of that nature. And she refused to use them at that time. She would say, you know, these things are not good for you. But family, I think, is very, very important in our lives. And because of that, we have a great life. You know, our friends, our family, and relatives that we have, we just wouldn't change it for the world.
Because just a minute.
Yeah.
Because this is being recorded as an archive and a keepsake for family, friends, and future generations, what would you want to be remembered about your life? Any specific thing in the West End? Like, what are some of the lessons you learned from growing up there? Or is there something or someone you hope is never forgotten by future generations?
Well, you know, like I said to you, family was very, very important to me, and my family was very important. But growing up, I became a dentist, and I worked in the city, and I think I did some contributions that I'm proud of in the city. I became the venerable of the G. Verdi Lodge, and in my time that I served there, we built a new hall for the new generations that were coming forward, and then eventually the hall got sold, but it's still a structure in the West End. As a dentist, I feel proud of the fact that I was influential in bringing perhaps a half a dozen young dentists to this city, They're still working here. They've raised beautiful families, and they always thank me for the thought of bringing them in with the connection that they had. But as far as my friends are concerned, they're all special to me. And you take Dr. Lulu Kenda, Mike Nanny, my old gang from the West End. We still get together once a month or thereabouts for dinner. Peter Scarfone, Alfio Gasparelli, Ray Startini. These are all my friends that I grew up with in the West End. We still get together. Bert Luciani. I don't want to leave anybody out. We lost an awful lot of them in the last 5 or 6 years, but they're still remembered. And then there's Rudy Paris, Norman Candelori. All these people are so special to me. We don't see each other that often anymore, but, you know, we still have the respect for each other when we do. Then there's the other younger generation that I grew up with recently, like Gene Chiarelli, a very close cousin of mine, Joe Bisceglia, people that, you know, are nice to be with. We have Ron Nino, very close friend of mine. He moved away from the Sioux, worked for the city at the time, and he's in Florida. And unfortunately now he's ailing, but we'll still call each other twice a week. And, you know, we'll never forget that kind of a friendship as we grow up. And those people, to me, are people that left their own mark. I'm associated with them, and I feel good about that. Yeah.
My closing comment would be, as I tell my friends quite often, treasure your family, treasure your friends, because at a certain age you don't have the energy to make dear friends like you have. And I tell parents very often, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Do never abandon your children. They will come back to you. And they have, in many cases, to families. And those are my closing words. It's been a pleasure.